History's villains had one major problem. They didn't write the books, their enemies did. That monster you learned about in high school, the one with the terrifying nickname or the blood-soaked reputation, might have actually been a decent person who just happened to lose a war or offend the wrong writer. Today, we're peeling back layers of propaganda, jealous rivalries, and centuries of tabloid-style gossip to look at 10 infamous figures who got absolutely destroyed by history's narrative. Some of these revelations will shock you, some will make you angry, and at least one will make you wonder what other truths in your brain are just 500-year-old lies. Let's fix some reputations and look at the glitches in the historical record. Number 1. Catherine the Great, the Empress and the Horse Myth. If you've heard of Catherine the Great, you've likely heard the horse story. If you haven't, I am begging you, do not Google it. Stay innocent. That disgusting rumor, which suggests she died while engaging in a lewd act with a horse, wasn't a historical fact. It was a weaponized lie started by her political enemies in France and Russia immediately after her death. Why? Because in the 18th century, if you couldn't defeat a powerful, intellectually superior woman on the battlefield or in the courtroom, you attacked her morality. It's the oldest, laziest trick in the book, and unfortunately, it worked for over 200 years. The real Catherine was a powerhouse of the Enlightenment. While her enemies were busy drafting fan fiction about her personal life, she was busy corresponding with philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot. She didn't just talk about progress, she implemented it. Catherine reformed the Russian education system, creating schools for girls when that was considered a radical, dangerous idea. But her most heroic moment was one of public health. During a terrifying smallpox outbreak, when her subjects were hiding in fear of the new science of inoculation, Catherine didn't just order them to get the shot. She sat down in front of her court, rolled up her royal sleeve, and became one of the first world leaders to be publicly vaccinated. She risked her life to prove the science was safe, saving millions of her subjects. She was a scientist queen, but history tried to turn her into a punchline. Number 2. Napoleon Bonaparte, the short man with the world's best code. The internet loves a short king meme, and Napoleon is the poster child for the Napoleon complex, the idea that short men overcompensate with aggression. Here is the glitch. Napoleon wasn't short. At the time of his death, he was measured at 5 feet 2 inches in French units. However, French inches were longer than British inches. In modern measurements, Napoleon was 5 feet 7. For a Frenchman in the early 1800s, 5 feet 7 was actually slightly above average. He looked short because he was constantly surrounded by his imperial guard, who were recruited specifically for being exceptionally tall. British propaganda took that unit conversion error and ran with it, drawing cartoons of a tiny, temperamental man to make him seem less threatening to the English public. But while the British were busy drawing him as a midget, Napoleon was rewriting the DNA of the modern world. He created the Napoleonic Code, a legal framework so revolutionary it abolished feudalism and established legal equality. Every time you benefit from a fair contract, property rights, or the separation of church and state, you are participating in Napoleon's legacy. He wasn't a tiny man screaming for attention. He was a giant of civil law whose shadow still covers nearly half of the legal systems on Earth today. Number 3. Vlad the Impaler, the terrorist who saved a nation. Vlad Dracula is the ultimate bad guy. His nickname, the Impaler, is not something you get for being a people person. He famously lined the borders of his territory with thousands of people impaled on stakes, a sight so gruesome it reportedly made an invading Ottoman sultan turn his entire army around in disgust. This sounds like pure, unadulterated evil, and from a modern perspective, it is. But if you look at the glitch in the context, a different picture emerges. Vlad was the ruler of Wallachia, a tiny region caught between massive empires. He was hopelessly outgunned and outnumbered by the Ottoman military. He knew he couldn't win a fair fight, so he turned to psychological warfare. The forest of the impaled wasn't just cruelty, it was a high-stakes keep-out sign. It was designed to save his people from total conquest by making the enemy too terrified to step foot on his soil. It worked. He defended Europe's eastern flank, using nightmare fuel as his primary weapon. In Romania today, he isn't a vampire, he's a national hero who did the unthinkable to ensure his people weren't wiped off the map. Number 4. Marie Antoinette, the scapegoat who never said cake. Let them eat cake. It's the most famous "I don't care about poor people" quote in history. Except Marie Antoinette never said it. The phrase first appeared in a book by Jean-Jacques Rousseau when Marie was only 10 years old and living in Austria. She hadn't even arrived in France yet. The quote was a common trope used to describe frivolous princesses for decades, and the French revolutionaries simply pinned it on her because she was an outsider, she was young, and she was Austrian. The real Marie Antoinette was a 14-year-old girl thrown into a shark tank of French court politics. While the public was told she was spending the national treasury on diamonds, the truth was that France was bankrupt because of expensive wars, including the American Revolution, that started long before she had any power. In reality, Marie was surprisingly compassionate. She adopted several orphans, supported struggling families with her own allowance, and often sold her royal silverware to buy grain for the poor during famines. She was a naive teenager who became the face of a systemic collapse she didn't cause. She was the victim of a 100-year-old debt crisis, but history remembered her as a girl who liked cake too much. Number 5. Emperor Nero, the firefighter who lost the PR war. The image of Nero fiddling while Rome burned is iconic. It depicts a madman laughing at the suffering of his people. There's just a tiny problem. The fiddle wouldn't be invented for another 1,000 years, so unless Nero was a time traveler, he definitely wasn't playing the violin during the Great Fire of 64 AD. In fact, most historians now agree that Nero wasn't even in Rome when the fire started. He was at his villa in Antium, miles away. When he heard the news, he didn't laugh. He rushed back to the city and personally organized the relief efforts. He opened his private palaces to house the homeless, brought in food supplies at his own expense, and drafted new building codes to ensure the city would be safer from fire in the future. So why is he a villain? Because he taxed the wealthy senators and aristocrats to pay for these relief efforts. He chose the common people over the elite. Those same elite senators were the ones who wrote the history books after his death. They turned a king who fed the poor into a maniac who burned the city. It's the ultimate example of why you should never piss off the people who own the printing presses.
Number 6. Al Capone, the gangster who fed Chicago. Let's be extremely clear. Al Capone was a racketeer, a murderer, and the mastermind behind a criminal empire built on bootlegging and brutal violence. This isn't a redemption story, but it is a complexity story. During the height of the Great Depression, when the American government was essentially telling starving families to figure it out, Al Capone did something the politicians wouldn't. He opened one of the first and largest soup kitchens in Chicago. His kitchen served 3 hot meals a day to thousands of desperate, unemployed people. No questions asked, no paperwork required. While the feds were trying to put him in prison, he was the one ensuring that children in the South Side had bread on the table. He was also the man responsible for expiration dates on milk. After a family member got sick from spoiled dairy, Capone used his influence to force milk processors to stamp dates on their bottles, a move that eventually became a global public health standard. He was a monster, yes, but he was a monster who filled the gaps left by a failing government. History hates contradictions, but Al Capone was a walking, talking paradox. Number 7. Antonio Salieri, the murderer who taught geniuses. If you've seen the movie Amadeus, you know Salieri as the bitter, mediocre composer who was so jealous of Mozart's genius that he eventually poisoned him. It's a great story, and it won 8 Oscars, but it is almost 100% fiction.
In reality, Salieri and Mozart were professional colleagues who actually liked and respected each other. They collaborated on music together, and Mozart even wrote letters to his wife describing how Salieri attended his operas and cheered the loudest. Salieri didn't need to be jealous. He was actually far more successful and famous than Mozart during their lifetimes. He held the most prestigious musical positions in Europe. After Mozart died young, likely from a kidney infection or fever, Salieri didn't celebrate, he grieved. He went on to teach music for decades, and his student list is a who's who of legends: Beethoven, Liszt, and Schubert. He even taught Mozart's own son for free as a tribute to his late friend. Salieri's real legacy is that he trained the next generation of musical gods, but history traded his kindness for a fake murder plot to sell movie tickets. Number 8. Alfred Nobel, the Merchant of Death's rebrand. Alfred Nobel invented dynamite. He intended for it to be used in mining and construction to save lives by replacing more volatile, dangerous explosives. However, the world quickly realized it was even better at blowing people up in wars. Nobel became incredibly wealthy selling the tools of destruction. The glitch in his story happened in 1888 when his brother Ludwig died. A French newspaper got the brothers confused and published Alfred's obituary while he was still very much alive. The headline read, "The Merchant of Death is dead." It went on to describe him as a man who became rich by finding ways to kill more people faster than ever before. Alfred read his own obituary and was absolutely horrified. He realized that if he didn't act, that would be his only legacy. He immediately tore up his will and used his massive fortune to establish the Nobel Prizes, specifically the Nobel Peace Prize. He spent the rest of his life trying to outrun his own reputation. He didn't just change his mind, he bought a new identity for himself, proving that sometimes the best way to fix your PR is to fund the world's most prestigious awards.
Number 9. Niccolo Machiavelli, the patriot labeled a snake. If you call someone Machiavellian, you're calling them a ruthless, backstabbing snake. This reputation comes from his book The Prince, which famously argues that it is better for a ruler to be feared than loved. Because of this, history remembers him as the patron saint of tyrants. But here is the massive glitch. Machiavelli didn't write The Prince as a how-to guide for evil. He wrote it as a job application while he was in exile, trying to get back into the good graces of the Medici family. In his other, much more extensive writings, Machiavelli was a passionate defender of republics, freedom, and the power of the common citizen. He hated tyrants. He spent his career trying to protect his home, Florence, from being crushed by outside empires. The Prince was simply an honest, cynical look at how power actually works, not how we wish it worked. He was a political scientist reporting from the front lines of reality. But because he was honest about the darkness of politics, history decided he was the one who invented the darkness. He wasn't the villain, he was just the guy who pointed out that the emperor had no clothes. Number 10. Captain William Bligh, the tyrant who was too nice. Every Hollywood movie about the mutiny on the Bounty depicts Captain Bligh as a screaming, whip-cracking dictator who pushed his crew to the breaking point. This is a total character assassination. In reality, Bligh was considered dangerously soft by the standards of the British Navy. He rarely used the lash, he mandated that his crew exercise and dance on deck to stay healthy, and he was obsessed with their nutrition to prevent scurvy. The mutiny didn't happen because Bligh was mean, it happened because the crew had spent months in Tahiti and didn't want to leave their new lives and girlfriends to go back to hard work on a ship. When the mutineers kicked Bligh off the ship, they left him in a tiny 23-foot boat with no maps and almost no food in the middle of the Pacific. In one of the greatest feats of navigation in human history, Bligh managed to sail that tiny boat 3,600 miles to safety without losing a single man. He was a hero, a master sailor, and a humane leader.
But because the mutineers needed to justify their crime when they got home, they painted him as a monster. History isn't a solid stone. It's a story told by the winners, the survivors, and the people with the sharpest pens. From the short emperor who stood tall in the law books to the murderous composer who taught the world's greatest geniuses, these 10 figures prove that a reputation is often just a shadow cast by someone else's light. The next time you hear a historical figure described as a one-dimensional monster, remember that there is likely a glitch in the record, and the truth is far more human and far more interesting than the myth. If you're ready to stop believing the propaganda, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments which villain do you think deserves a second chance. We'll see you in the next one.